Hello, everyone, and welcome to our session, which is a roundtable discussion featuring the chairs of our invited symposia. Our last day of ARP, and we hope you've been enjoying the programming so far. This session is going to last 45 minutes, at which point we'll be talking with our emerging scholar awardees, and then we'll have a brief closing session, all within this space. So you don't have to go anywhere. After that, there's going to be another event that another social event happening, a social space in the Gathertown area, as well as some awesome mentoring opportunities. So that's all to come. Without further delay, I would love to, it's my honor to introduce the panelists on the people sitting at our roundtable. We have Moin Syed, Veronica Bennett Martinez, Yap Danison, Amber Gail Fellmeyer, and Laura King. Thank you so much for coming back, which is great. It means we didn't scare you away. You're back for more. Our vision for this session is that it's going to allow us to pick up on themes that have manifested across the conference in a fairly organic way. So if you have a question, a comment that you want to center in this discussion, you're welcome to do that in the chat. You're also invited to just speak up. So let's keep this organic. I thought maybe, because I have speaking privileges right now, I would start us off with a question and then we can go from there. My question is a rather self-interested one, actually, and it has to do with my status as an early career researcher. And I thought I would take this opportunity to seek advice from our panelists about how I can create a research program that is, reflective or embraces or embodies these commitments we've been talking about to social justice, equity, and inclusion. So I'll post this question that I have in the chat so you can see it as well. But essentially, I'm asking for what wisdom or perhaps words of advice or caution our panelists have for young or new researchers hoping to enact many of the calls to action that have been expressed across this conference.
Well, I'll make a comment that, oh, sorry, I think maybe Yap was, you were raising your hand.
Go first, go first.
I think you were saying something about, maybe it was before we were talking about like a fear of, could there be costs to focusing on diversity? And I was just going to say, as a fairly early career person myself, that I think that you shouldn't be afraid, and that you just, with everything that we do, you always have to make a case for it. You have to stick up for yourself. But I actually think that what these talks reflect is that people are really hungry for this diversity and for the novelty and a little bit of a paradigm shift these things reflect. So I actually think you should view the way ARP has framed this conference as really a call to action, and really that this is what the field is ready for and is hungry for. And actually, if you're an early career person, you're in a really good position to respond to that call and bring creative ideas to it.
Yeah, I want to briefly also add to that. So it's very difficult in general to give career advice. You can do so many things wrong. It's very difficult to predict all kinds of future things. So, having said that, I think there are two factors that, in my experience, are worth a lot. Like, first of all, you have to really find a topic that is close to your heart, that you feel passionate about. And of course, I don't know exactly how this is for you, but you sound very passionate about this topic. And this is always a good guidance, I think, to follow what you really believe in, what you feel passionate about. And second, what is also really helpful is if your topic is close to things that are important in society. And I think inclusion and diversity and all these related topics are so central in today's 21st century world. So you cannot pick a better topic in many regards. So there is no guarantee in career planning, but I think if you stick to your passion and find something that is really important for society, you can rarely do wrong.
I would just add, as someone who's still junior faculty as well, that it's a multifaceted sort of series of steps that you're taking, right? So there are ways that with our research, no matter what our overall interests are, our major questions are, there are ways that we can continually think about the approaches we're taking for recruiting, the approaches we're taking in interpreting findings and analyzing our work, the types of questions we're asking. There are ways that we can think about improvements to our mentoring. What are we modeling for our students? Who are we recruiting to assist in different phases of the research process, and getting them involved, getting them engaged and excited about our science? What are the ways that we're teaching, and how are the ways that we can sometimes go a little bit further in the topics or in the kinds of authors, the kinds of populations being represented, no matter what courses we're teaching, whether it's very broad, whether it is an opportunity to maybe create a new course that might help address and fill in some gaps as well. And then even thinking about forms of engagement, forms of service that may, again, further uplift either community partners, support, bring our research back to a broader array of partners and stakeholders than who otherwise are sometimes coming on campuses, sometimes less motivated for whatever reason to do so. Bringing the research to them, thinking about opportunities to support students and other rising scholars within and beyond the lab. I think you'll find that a lot of those approaches are complementary to each other. If your work's reflecting some of this, it's easier to bring it into your teaching. It's easier to get more students excited about it who want to contribute in the lab, so on and so forth. And if you find some small steps in some of those different domains, that might be a nice way to take the work you're already passionate about and just further strengthen that with more diverse perspectives, more approaches to think about your methods, your reasoning, and so on as you continue to go forward.
Yeah, I agree. I love that Jordan brought in all these different aspects of what we do. I might say that I know that when a person is an assistant professor, you feel like at least I felt like every day I would go to bed and ask myself, what did I do to get tenure today? Like, how am I going to get tenure today? And I think that with regard to some of these goals, it may not be about that. It might be about planting seeds, so that while you're doing the big goal of getting tenure, you're planting seeds that are going to pay off in the area of diversity and inclusion by the students that you mentor in your lab, right? By the ways that you present our science to students, right? So those may be more long-term goals that may not ultimately have direct impact on tenure, but might have an enormous promise for our field.
I'm told that my hand is not visible for some reason, so to what has been said so far, which is wonderful, I would only add two things. One is that besides thinking about, those issues in terms of sort of having a sensibility towards our samples, towards colleagues, as students, sort of a kind of a way of doing things in our profession, it might be, for some people, it might also be a good idea to incorporate those questions into the research program. So whatever you study, you could study happiness, or you could study something that is very cognitive. Whatever you study, I'm sure you can incorporate, questions that relate to issues around diversity and ethnicity and race and culture somehow. I think that can always be done, regardless of, in our field at least. So that's one sort of very organic way to always keep those issues then in mind, to kind of have those issues in mind when you developing your questions and thinking about your methods, etc. And another issue could be, I'm wondering if it's a good idea for junior faculty to have a very early conversation with their chairs and some of their colleagues about how they're going to, why they care about those issues and how they're going to go about doing it, so that there is an early understanding from the chairs and from the people who will be doing, the 3-year evaluation of the candidate, that it might be harder to publish some of those research in some, in mainstream journals, to make the chairs aware of some of the challenges. That would be another advice I would have for junior faculty, so that they are on your side, so they're with you. And I mean, I remember when when I have been reviewed, something that it was in my statement is that at that time when I was doing cross-cultural work back in the day, it was very hard. It was very labor intensive to collect data across cultures, or to even target minority samples, community samples. It's much harder than just collecting data from the subject pool. So this would be the two ideas I wanted to contribute.
To offer something a little bit different than what's been said already, I've always characterized my approach, and Joanne has heard me talk about this, we've had conversation about this before, as kind of a bicultural approach to engaging in my work. And many of my colleagues do the same thing. So there are times, I guess it's a broader way of thinking about who's your audience, who you're really wanting to engage with. And so sometimes I do things that do work that's appropriate and suitable and potentially received okay from mainstream psychological or scientific audiences. And sometimes I do work that's not for them, right? And so it doesn't go to those journals, it goes to other places, right? And so you do a little bit of both. And so you can do kind of things that are palatable to the mainstream, but also do work that's a little bit more funky and a little weird and, really maybe is more satisfying in some ways. Sometimes they're both satisfying in different ways, I think. But that's always been the approach to this two pronged. So occupying both spaces and understanding that those are different strategies, those are different audiences. Again, I think it's a broader point for anybody is to think about your audience. I think we, especially early career researchers, but everybody tends to think that everyone is going to care about your research. And that's definitely not true, right? Sometimes you do a study that's a great study, but only a small community really needs to know about that, right? And so that doesn't go into the mainstream generalist journals. That should go to a more targeted outlet. So I think thinking a little bit more strategically about who really needs to engage with your work is helpful. Yeah, Joanne put the analogy there to, indie musicians, signing with the big label to, fund their further creative work. It's kind of like, it's a similar kind of idea.
I'll just follow up quickly what you said, Moy, because I think that is a good way of thinking about how you do research. For example, I do have a line of research that focuses on like mental health and well-being among displaced populations and refugees. Now that work goes into, personality outlets, right? It goes into a different, different set of journals. And I think that's fine. And I think it's also helpful to think about what your target audience is, right? So for example, it might be that open access journals are particularly helpful for this type of work, because you want people in those contexts to be able to easily access them. But one comment I'll make is, and this is just for my personal experience completely, is that I do have a sense that I'm literally code switching when I'm going back and forth between talking to personality folks and people in that realm. I almost feel like, I'm picking up one research hat and put on another hat, right? I'm talking very different terms, and it's worth reflecting on why that needs to be the case, right? I understand to some extent there are disciplinary differences and different focus and interests. The displaced work I do is it's applied, so I get it. But it's interesting, right? At least in my career thus far, I felt like there has to be this sort of clear going back and forth, right? So I'm either talking about personality processes, or I'm talking about functioning among displaced Sri Lankan refugees.
I just want to highlight a question in the chat from Brinkley about related to Nick's question, but kind of reframing it in the context of graduate students. So she says, related to the fear and risk involved, are there specific resources set up to harness this relative social power in the field possessed by certain individuals, i.e. mid-career or later folks, people with privileged identities, to support students and early career researchers who may receive pushback or fallout from their work in this area? So basically kind of what can people who have tenure do to help out the rest of us?
Might I ask a question whether somebody can give an example of this that I can think better? Have there been many instances where senior faculty have not been helpful, and so that I can get a better understanding? I know that there are instances, but just to get the question a bit clearer for me.
So I can speak on it. So I'm certainly not talking about my mentorship. I have amazing
Right.
mentorship who's always willing to talk about these kind of things, you know, but, you know, I guess I see people, and not even just early career researchers. I mean, I see mid-career researchers who have a real sort of hesitance to talk about some of these things or make actions on them based on what they perceive may be the negative outcomes personally, which I think it's reasonable. You know, I think we're talking about positionality statements in the earlier talk, and that being an area in which some individuals with marginalized identities, especially those that are invisible, may be very conflicted about whether or not they want to place that out there. And I just sort of, my question was sort of like, is there room for there being a group of individuals who say sort of like, you know what, if this happens to you, even if it's something small, like a reviewer challenges you and says, you know, why do you have a sample of only Latinx children? Just somebody who can be, people who can be a resource for people who don't have mentors who are necessarily sort of like versed in that, to say, hey, this is how I would respond to that reviewer in a way that is, you know, still advocating for, you know, what we need in the field, but, you know, has the appropriate sort of like socio-political deference. Just help people who maybe don't have that, some of sort of like the hidden knowledge, like the hidden curriculum.
Right. Yeah. How to mobilize a kind of support network around this topic, right? Yeah, that's a really good question, I think. I don't know, does ARP have a structure already like this? Probably you have all communities maybe that discuss these topics together, or maybe if not, that would be a nice thing.
I'm just going to take this opportunity to plug our mentoring sessions that are happening during the social time. That's one kind of structural way to talk to some folks who may be going with these questions, but shameless plug.
Yeah, because for EAPP, that's we are from the European Association. We have also those mentoring opportunities. So members of EAPP, but I think also people who are not members, they can match up with like more senior members. And I think those really important issues would be excellent topics to discuss, because I agree that it can feel very lonely potentially if you don't have the direct support network at your institution. So feel free to make use of that. And also the ARP initiative is really good, I think.
I had one comment about this also, that I think that in my own experience, I didn't always feel that I found a lot of mentors or, you know, navigated some things. I mean, I think everyone probably feels this way to some extent, but I would say that at the moment, I'm at the point that I made certain commitments, like, okay, I want to be conducting research in Africa, or, you know, the point I made some challenging decisions where, like, okay, this is going to be hard data to get. This is going to be a slow process. This is going to affect my number of publications. I'm going to have more quality, less quantity. But I think at the moment that I made, you know, a certain commitment to my concern about representation in psychology, et cetera, mentors started coming out of the woodwork, and I have had some really senior people reach out to me and actually offer to write me letters of recommendation and offer to help me in different ways, in ways that I didn't have before, which sort of makes sense because, you know, I think that when you take a stance and you start trying to do something that is difficult, I think that you do naturally maybe find some allies, and they might not be at your institution. But if you're, you know, like example you gave of doing something with Latinx children, and maybe people in your institution are saying, well, why? Or reviewers are saying this, it's a good moment to reach out to the more senior people who are doing some of this work. And chances are that they will feel particularly passionate about supporting you, and not just like, oh, you're a smart person, I would like you, you know, to succeed, but just that they're truly excited that someone's following in this work and will give you something a little extra. So I think it's, again, in science, I think we're always building on things, and are always need to be looking for these communities and the other people who are doing similar work who will be, I think, quite excited and supportive.
Thank you very much to everyone for this super generative conversation. You've given me a lot to think about, and I really appreciate the directions it's heading. But there is another topic that's been raised in the chat, and this one's offered by Joanne. It says, one thing that's been brought up as a common thread across the symposia is that we don't study minorities within majority cultures. And I'm curious to hear what people's thoughts are about what the barriers have been and how we can move forward in that area. Laura.
Yeah, okay. I think at least one barrier, I'm not sure, I don't have any idea what the actual answer is to this question. I think one of the barriers is the line between personality and social psychology. And I feel like we gave them that question, like we somehow gave up that question. And I think the other is was somewhat anticipated in Nick's question, which is, how do you explain why it's important to look at these samples at just these, like focusing on such samples? And I think that is a not that difficult of an argument to make, right? Like, well, I mean, yes, we're personality psychologists, but certainly we understand that situations, social contexts matter, and that history might matter, and that centuries of oppression might make a difference between two groups, that it isn't the case that we already know everything there is to know about personality because we've done such a great job of studying white people. And I think that it shouldn't be difficult to make that argument. I'm trying to make that argument currently, right? So in my students and I have this project on authenticity, right? And everyone knows authenticity is so great for your well-being. Is that the case if you are a member of a marginalized group, if you are concerned about being stereotyped, if you are engaged in code switching, right? How does the context of oppression relate to the role of authenticity and well-being among Black Americans, right? And I think that sort of thinking about some of the really central things that we talk about are actually questions we could just assume are embedded in entitlement and white privilege, and placing them in minoritized contexts is really interesting. And actually, my way back in the Stone Age when I used to study narratives, right, we were able to publish in the Journal of Personality a paper that only had gay men and lesbians in it. It is possible to publish research on minoritized groups in mainstream personality, right? By showing the remarkable ways such groups allow us to bring really common issues into particular types of focus. So I do think it's possible, and I don't know why we've avoided it. Or if I do know why, I prefer not to say. Right? Do you want me to say why I think that is, why we have that blind spot, Veronica? I think honestly, I think it has something to do with Walter Mischel. I'm sorry, I keep talking about him. Sorry, Walter, he's rolling over in his grave all the time. But with that person situation debate and the timing of the debate, when personality psychology was viewed as part of the establishment, we said that it's the individual's responsibility. I was at a Society for Personology conference, and Ravenna Helson shared this, her description of what happened. And it was just very different from my understanding of this kind of intellectual debate. And it was much more about the civil rights movement. And Walter Mischel had his hand, had his hand on the pulse of what was really going on in the world. And that's why that argument, which was, as we all eventually figured out, technically not very solid, really had an impact, because it fit with what everyone else in the world was noticing, which is the situation was unfair. And by changing that situation, we can improve people's lives. Personality psychology at that moment became this bastion of it's the person. And that in that zeitgeist, not a particularly great stance.
If I may, I agree with you, Laura, but I think we also need to understand that when I received training in personality, I was told that personality was precisely what was free in a way, if you remove culture and context, and minority status, that's what personality was, sort of that emphasis on traits and a very decontextualized definition of personality that I know that we, at least the people I talk to, everyone here, we don't hold that vision anymore. But I think that we're unfairly characterized, as you said, but many people actually kind of believe that too, I would say. But maybe I'm being unfair to the field.
I just want to speak up and say that we have the same problem over in social psych after all. So it's not like it's just on the personality side, right? We have this problem of assuming that we're studying universals. It's because of this idea that our science is about human universals. And we study those human universals in upper class white people and assume that that will generalize to everybody else. So while on the one hand, I really appreciate Laura providing the context for understanding that personality was seen as sort of the conservative end of the spectrum, the one of saying it's your personal responsibility, it's your personal character that has determined your outcomes, versus over in social psychology as saying, no, it's the situation, let's remove that, and you will see that these people can do amazing things without the weight of oppression. I appreciate that being called out, but in both cases, both of our sister disciplines have this issue of assuming that we're studying universals as opposed to something that is contextually bounded. And I think we know to some extent that that's wrong, but it's scary to, I think, contemplate how wrong that can be.
So this has been a great discussion for me, at least so far. But I have a somewhat related question, and it's, I think, a more pragmatic question, or a more process-based question. So as we're I feel like a lot of the talks that we've seen have really focused on or have demonstrated kind of the limits of personality, like the limits of our methods, the limits of our epistemology, and the necessity of building bridges with social or with other disciplines. And I'm wondering, for folks who have done this or are currently doing this, do you have any kind of practical tips for scholars who want to collaborate cross-disciplinary or across areas?
Kelsey, do you have specific areas in mind that you're interested in trying to bring together? Or
yeah.
Just in general?
So I guess for myself, I find myself thinking a lot more, I study friendships and personality, and you can't kind of decontextualize relationships from the larger society. So I've been personally thinking about well, maybe I should talk to some people in sociology about the way that they think about things. So just thinking for myself about that particular bridge, but there could be others. Yeah.
Yeah, Kelsey, that's a really good question, I think. I have also always tried this, combining different fields. And I think what really helps is to take the long view. So in the beginning, it might be a little bit more difficult because, you have double the literature to learn. But over time, you really reap also the benefits, because you get into different areas, you read different traditions, you get different networks. So it's really a strategy that really pays out in the long run. So I'm very excited that you're considering this, and I would really encourage you. And I also saw something really nice that Laura said, and now many people reacted it already in the chat, like we need to point out why our discipline is needed, as a sort of phrase, a positive case, what our discipline can contribute to, all these issues of emancipation, diversity, and that is sometimes a little bit missing. So I would really love to brainstorm with people about how we can do this, because without formulating a positive viewpoint, I think we are not inspiring enough people. At least that's my personal opinion. So I really like this call that Laura raised, and I hope that we can somehow bring this forward.
I appreciate the question, Kelsey, and I agree with Jaap's point about it's really useful to read widely in different disciplines. It's much easier to do that than to actively collaborate across disciplines. I had high aspirations about working with sociologists and anthropologists and all that kind of stuff. And that's great, sounds wonderful. And if you can do it, it's also wonderful, but it's really challenging. And I'm not saying to discourage anyone from doing it, but it is challenging to do when you don't have sort of your basic assumptions about structures and personhoods and terms and all that kind of stuff. It's totally different. It takes a while to get there. So, I mean, I would suggest kind of starting a little bit closer to home. Kate McLean's here. I don't know if there's any other banana slugs, but the two of us are sort of unique. We went to Santa Cruz, our PhDs there, where the personality area isn't with the social area, it's with the developmental area. And so we were both trained sort of seeing personality and developmental as sort of part of the same system. And if you haven't read it, Brewster Smith wrote a wonderful paper about why the merging of personality and social, or the relation, was a major mistake in the history of psychology, and that it should have been personality and lifespan development a long time ago, and for all the reasons for why that's the case. Really nice paper, you should read it. So, I actually think that if the personality, and there are plenty of people who do that, but I think if we did more aligning, looking to what developmental is doing, that takes a much more social, structural, contextual view versus the situational view of social psychology, which has just major limitations for understanding diversity and how it actually functions at a societal level. I think personality and development, to me, form kind of an ultimate psychology. But not to say it would solve all problems, but that might be a place to start if you haven't already, is sort of engage more with developmentalists and kind of see where that takes you, because it's less of a major leap to try to get on the same page and be able to be productive.
I've sometimes, sorry, other people had hands up. So
Go for it. No, you're fine.
I mean, one of the other things that I found is that in terms of kind of going across disciplines too, is that sometimes finding societies and meetings that are more topical. So like for me with well-being, if you go to the well-being meetings for societies and conferences that are specifically focused on those, then you actually have people come that are economists and sociologists and demographers, but they're starting with some shared perspective on things. And those are actually more likely to lead to collaborations across people in different disciplines and have different perspectives than just going to someone in your sociology department who looks interesting and kind of has these things. So if you can kind of identify those small meetings where people share some basic interest in a topic, I think that can be helpful as well.
Yeah, and I would just add, I agree with a lot of the points that have been brought up already. I think there's a lot of promising sort of outlets and activities that can help sort of grow those connections with folks, or find some rich connections. Thinking a little bit closer along the lines of starting smaller within the department, I think you can go just a bit larger, and think about some possible connections around your campus. Sometimes you'll find folks who are interested in some comparable research questions who might be coming from different fields. I've literally stumbled into a few opportunities for collaboration with some colleagues on my campus in that regard. It's a broader question on family science, or a broader question on personality in some way. Finding folks who are interested from nursing and sociology, and just happen to be interest in some of those same approaches. So it's a little bit murkier sometimes. Sometimes having a focused meeting you could attend that's on a certain topic, that'll be a really nice step. But in between some of those kinds of meetings, there might be some other opportunities as well. I'm just thinking along those lines.
Oh, yeah, I was just going to add something similar, that recently the lexical studies that I was talking about in my presentation for this all had co-authors who were linguists, and that was a really interesting experience. I think sometimes a nice way to maybe have a cross-disciplinary collaboration is to have a really clear project to start. This is going to be a personality project, but I want to get your help and your expertise. And it kind of lets the person off the hook. You're not trying to come to consensus about what the project is about, what the paper is about. You know, you have some kind of defined areas that person is helping you with, but it creates a context to have really interesting conversations. And yeah, you can never do that without bumping into things where the terminology that maybe you've been using for years all of a sudden is very disturbing to this other person. I mean, you end up learning a lot of things and looking at things from different perspectives, but maybe that's a way that can make it more manageable and not, you know, coming from totally different paradigms. And I will say also a couple of people have said things about going to other conferences. I think it's, I mean, I guess I assume that most people do that we all belong to multiple organizations. And I think that that is just always a great thing to do. And maybe you have something like ARP that you've been coming to for years and it's a little bit predictable, you know who's going to be there, and you go to something else. For me personally, one I went to this year, I've been trying to learn, get more sophisticated about qualitative methodology, because I'm adding that in and really wasn't trained on it. And I went to this conference, the European Qualitative Methods in Psychology Conference, and it was online, but it was, of course, feeling like very out of place. Everybody else knows each other. There's a lot of shared frames of reference and things. So there's one sense of feeling a little bit out of place, and I don't know anyone, I don't know what they're talking about, and yet also so exciting, and you're scribbling notes and Googling things and learning things, and it's really mentally refreshing. You come back to your own main area with lots of new ideas and perspectives. So I just really want to second that suggestion that somebody else made in the chat.
Awesome. Thank you for all these suggestions. I think we have about 5 minutes before we switch over to the Emerging Scholar Award. So if anyone from the audience would like to throw a rapid fire question into the chat, or you can raise your hand, feel free to do so.
Can I ask a question? It's just coming off the top of my head, so forgive me in my wording, but it's so nice to see Amber and Yap and Veronica here, because this kind of relates. I guess what I'm thinking of is that, you know, we often think about diversity and inclusion in North American contexts, which are very important, and it's very important right now, right? But I also appreciate, I think Aranda was talking about this in the welcome, where how can we as members of ARP and, you know, in our various roles, acknowledge that, like, right, like especially as especially those of us who are North American, but also be aware of other people's kind of unique kind of experiences being in different regions. And I'm just I know it's the tail end of the conversation, but I'm curious to hear if you have any pressing or like burning thoughts about this. Thank you.
Yeah, Joanne, I actually think it's really important that our discipline branches out to different world regions, because we are now talking with many Americans, of course, it's the ARP and some Europeans, and I'm sure that there are also people from other regions, but there are still really large regions of the world where personality psychology is, I think, not studied that much. And that is really a very pressing concern, I think, for our field. And if you look at other countries, like, for example, China, there is a lot of neuroscience going on, but personality psychology is really at a disadvantage. And if we don't solve this problem, then our field is going to stay myopic. So we are diversifying now, we are taking other cultures into account, but we really need to expand the scope, in my view. This is a priority, I think.
This is just sort of anecdotal from so I do some work in Sweden on diversity related issues with immigrants and ethnic minorities there, where there has been very little psychological work with ethnic minorities in Sweden, and there are major disciplinary boundaries there. So one of the issues that we've come up across is trying to get funding for this work, and you really do need funding for it, especially within the Swedish higher education context. You have to have funding to do anything. We get reviewers mostly from social work and related areas, and they basically say this is our territory, more or less, and that you can't do it this way. And so it's just because those are the traditions within that context. I'm sure each country has its own kind of dynamics around that. So it's not, we submitted grants for 7 years, I think, before we finally got something funded. It was basically the same project. And it was largely just the basic premise was rejected because of these sort of territorial disputes. So I mean, that's just one little small barrier that even if you're wanting to do it, you might not be able to.
Thank you so much, Moyne, for those final thoughts in this roundtable. We're about 1 minute away from our deadline. So it's my pleasure to thank you all. So Jaap, Amber, Veronica, Moyne, Laura, for joining us today, for your generosity in the time you've given us, the ideas you've shared, but also for structuring this conference and really being the backbone of this conversation. Thank you for shepherding us through it. It can be a difficult conversation, I know that. And thank you for your leadership in the field broadly, because this is just, it's not the beginning nor the end, just, the part of this ongoing conversation that's taking new forms, textures all along. So we look forward to continuing it with you. I'm going to be passing off now to Joanne, who's going to be welcoming the next element of our program. So thank you once again, and thank you for everyone for the rich conversation.